begin with what the world actually looks like right now. This is not a normal moment in history. Active military conflicts are running simultaneously in Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, the Sahel region of Africa, and the Middle East. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the group that invented the doomsday clock during the Cold War, moved that clock to 89 seconds to midnight in January of 2026. What that number means requires a moment of genuine analytical attention. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest America ever came to nuclear war, the clock sat at 7 minutes to midnight. Right now, we are closer to catastrophe than at any point during the most dangerous standoff of the entire Cold War. That is not a metaphor. It is a measurement made by the people whose institutional purpose is to make it as accurately as possible. World military spending reached $2.718 trillion in 2024, a 9.4% jump in a single year, the steepest increase since the Cold War ended. The world's 15 largest military spenders all raised their budgets simultaneously, every single one of them. That is the kind of thing countries do when they are genuinely frightened about what is coming. Something is happening. And what I intend to do here is walk through exactly what that something is, step by step, domino by domino, because the individual pieces of this picture are being reported, but the connections between them are not being drawn clearly enough for the people who need to understand them. The first domino is the Strait of Hormuz. Most people outside specialist circles have never engaged seriously with this geography, but this narrow stretch of water, 33 kilometers wide, practically swimmable at its narrowest point, is the most consequential piece of geography on Earth right now. 20% of all the world's oil passes through it every single day. 20 million barrels feeding economies that have no alternative supply route at comparable volume. India draws 60% of its energy from that corridor. China, 40%. Japan, 75%. Japanese Prime Minister Takahashi stated it publicly and without ambiguity. If the strait closes, Japan runs out of oil in 8 to 9 months, and the entire Japanese economy collapses with it. The Iranians have closed it. Shipping traffic through Hormuz has dropped by roughly 75%. War risk insurance for vessels attempting passage has climbed approximately 50% in a matter of weeks. Brent crude has already jumped 39% from pre-conflict levels, crossing $110 per barrel. Natural gas in Europe is up 59%. Fertilizer, the input that grows your food, is up 34 to 35%. That is not a foreign policy problem in the abstract sense that foreign policy problems are usually discussed. That is a grocery bill problem, a heating bill problem, a problem that is already present in the economic lives of ordinary people who have no direct connection to the military situation in the Persian Gulf and no mechanism to insulate themselves from its consequences. The transmission belt from geopolitical crisis to household economic reality runs through energy prices, and that transmission belt is already operating. Now, connect energy to food, because most people never make that connection, and the failure to make it produces a serious misunderstanding of what is actually at stake. The Gulf countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, import 80% of their food. Kuwait gets 90% of its drinking water from desalination plants. Saudi Arabia, 70%. Across the Gulf region, 400 desalination plants produce nearly 40% of all desalinated water on Earth, and 100 million people depend on them directly for survival. Iran understands this architecture with precision, and what I observe when I analyze Iranian strategy in this conflict is that it is not oriented around defeating America in a head-to-head military confrontation. Iran cannot achieve that outcome, and its strategic planners know it. The play is to hit infrastructure, oil fields, desalination plants, energy hubs, systematically and at a cost ratio that the defending side cannot sustain indefinitely. One drone strike knocks out a desalination plant. Iran produces roughly 500 drones a day with an estimated stockpile of 80,000, each one costing at most $50,000. The American defensive missiles used to shoot them down cost $1 million each. That is a $950,000 disadvantage per drone every single time at every single intercept, and the mathematics only deteriorate at scale. When the volume of incoming drones exceeds the available intercept capacity, the defensive architecture begins to fail, not because it was poorly designed, but because the cost asymmetry makes sustained operation economically and logistically impossible. On March 19, 2026, the World Food Program issued an emergency warning. The Middle East conflict was triggering a rapidly unfolding humanitarian crisis, with fuel and transport costs feeding through the entire food system and raising prices in markets far removed from the fighting. This war is already present in global food supply chains. It simply has not been announced in those terms to the people who are feeling its effects at the checkout counter. The second dimension of what I am analyzing here is the nuclear question. This is where many people disengage because the assumption is that nobody would actually use nuclear weapons, that the catastrophic nature of the outcome makes it self-deterring. What I observe in the actual policy and doctrinal record is that this assumption is less reliable than it needs to be for the confidence it generates. The U.S. intelligence community's 2026 annual threat assessment stated in plain language that the most dangerous threat posed by Russia is an escalatory spiral leading to direct hostilities, including nuclear exchanges. Russia operates under a military doctrine called escalate to de-escalate, the strategic concept that if Russia begins losing badly in a conventional fight, the deployment of a tactical nuclear weapon serves not to win the conflict, but to force all parties to step back from the brink. Not irrational, cold, calculated, and built into Russian operational doctrine as a formal option. In June 2025, Ukraine launched drone strikes against Russian strategic bombers at the Olenya air base near the Kola Peninsula, which sits in close proximity to Russia's nuclear assets, a non-nuclear country deliberately targeting nuclear delivery systems. Analysts described it as one of the most destabilizing military actions in years, and the description was accurate in the specific sense that it compressed the decision space around a category of weapons that deterrence theory depends on keeping clearly separated from conventional military operations. France and the United Kingdom responded in July 2025 with the Northwood Declaration, publicly stating that their nuclear forces can be coordinated against any extreme European threat. August 2025, the Trump administration ordered 2 nuclear submarines deployed to the region in response to Russian provocations. Nuclear submarines deployed as a signal in an active conflict environment. And North Korea, which has been testing hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missiles and announced a nuclear-powered submarine of its own, sent over 15,000 troops plus thousands of engineers to fight alongside Russia in Ukraine in exchange for fuel, food, and military technology. The conflict in Ukraine stopped being a bilateral problem between Russia and Ukraine a considerable time ago. What I observe in its current form is a conflict that has drawn in nuclear-armed states on multiple sides and degraded the communication channels through which miscalculation has historically been prevented. The third dimension is Taiwan, and it is the variable that most geopolitical analysis is most systematically underweighting. While the Middle East burned and Ukraine ground on, China watched and prepared. The Pentagon's 2025 China Military Power Report concluded that China expects to be able to fight and win a war over Taiwan by the end of 2027, not an intelligence estimate of Chinese intentions. A stated Chinese military planning benchmark that American defense planning is now required to organize around. In 2025, Chinese aircraft conducted a record 3,570 incursions into Taiwan's surrounding airspace. December 2025, Beijing staged its largest military exercises around Taiwan in years. That same month, the United States approved more than $11 billion in arms sales to Taiwan, the largest package ever authorized. Taiwan's president proposed a special defense budget of approximately $40 billion over 8 years. Japan, constitutionally pacifist since the end of World War II, is now openly debating whether an attack on Taiwan triggers its own right to self-defense, and Japanese missiles are already being deployed to Yonaguni Island, approximately 70 miles from Taiwan's coast. What I observe in that deployment is not rhetorical positioning. It is physical military infrastructure being placed within strike range of a potential conflict zone by a country that has not placed military infrastructure in that posture since 1945. Should Taiwan fall, the entire Pacific balance of power shifts overnight. South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, every American ally in the region recalculates its survival assumptions. And the global semiconductor supply chain, much of which runs through Taiwanese manufacturing capacity, goes dark in ways that would affect every electronics-dependent industry on Earth within months. People ask why all of this is happening simultaneously. The honest analytical answer is that for 70 years, the world operated on a system constructed after World War II. American-led, with the dollar at its center, and American military bases as its enforcement mechanism. It was not a perfect system, but it held because the cost of challenging it was higher than the cost of operating within it for every major potential challenger. What is happening now is that system is being challenged from multiple directions at the same time by parties that have each calculated correctly or incorrectly that the moment for challenge has arrived. Russia is pushing on it in Eastern Europe. Iran is pushing on it in the Middle East. China is preparing to push on it in the Pacific. And the United States itself is internally divided about whether to defend that system or withdraw from the commitments that sustain it. Countries around the world are responding to that uncertainty with their defense budgets. 18 NATO members now spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense, the highest number since that guideline was adopted. Poland is spending 4.48% of its GDP on its military. Sweden, neutral for 200 years, raised its defense spending by 34% in a single year in 2024. Countries do not make those commitments when they feel secure. They make them when they have concluded that the security environment has changed in ways that require them to provide for their own defense at a scale they previously delegated to the collective system. What happens next unfolds in a sequence whose early steps are already visible. Energy prices have already spiked. Oil has crossed $110 per barrel. Gas has climbed nearly 60% in Europe. Fertilizer is up 35%. Every country that imports food felt the transmission the moment it hit global commodity markets. Food insecurity is already escalating. Over 670 million people were already experiencing hunger before this latest round of fighting. The World Food Program is describing the current situation as a dual choke point crisis. Supply chains already stressed by Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, now facing simultaneous disruption at Hormuz. The arithmetic of that combination does not produce a manageable shortage. It produces cascading failure in the logistics systems that move food from where it is grown to where it is needed. Regional expansion is the next stage of the sequence. The more the conflict widens, the more proxy forces get activated, the more choke points close, the greater the pressure on Japan, South Korea, and India to involve themselves in ways that protect their energy supply lines. That is not a political choice those governments will make freely. It is arithmetic. When 75% of your energy passes through a contested strait and that strait is effectively closed, the decision about whether to act to reopen it is not a foreign policy preference. It is a survival calculation. Economic contagion follows from regional expansion with a logic that financial markets understand even when political commentary has not yet caught up. Gulf states have long been significant investors in American financial markets. If those countries are destabilized, if their sovereign wealth funds are forced to liquidate assets to fund their own defense and manage their own economic emergency, the American stock market does not experience a normal correction. It experiences the withdrawal of a category of patient long-term capital that has been one of the structural supports of American asset valuations for decades. The pension accounts, the retirement savings, the household wealth of ordinary Americans that are tied to those markets absorb that withdrawal directly. And over all of this sits the nuclear shadow, the condition that makes every other risk in this analysis qualitatively different from the risks of previous periods of geopolitical tension. The conditions for miscalculation have never been more dangerous. Multiple nuclear-armed states are in active or near-active conflict. The communication channels between adversaries that have historically served as the circuit breakers of nuclear escalation are degraded or absent. The Doomsday Clock panel specifically noted in 2026 an almost complete absence of communication on strategic stability among nuclear adversaries. That absence is the most dangerous single ingredient in the current environment, not because any party is planning to initiate a nuclear exchange, but because the pathway to nuclear use that history and doctrine both identify as most likely is not deliberate first use. It is miscalculation. It is a sequence of actions and reactions, each one locally rational, that collectively produces an outcome that no individual decision maker chose and that every rational actor would have preferred to avoid. Wars almost never start because everyone sat down and decided they wanted one. They start because nobody watched the dominoes fall until it was too late. The diplomats, the generals, the presidents managing the situation, most of them do not want escalation. But the machinery of escalation runs on its own logic once it has been set in motion. Once nuclear submarines have been deployed, once negotiators have been killed, once water infrastructure has been destroyed, the off-ramps get narrower with each successive step. At 89 seconds to midnight, there is not much margin remaining for a mistake. What I want to leave you with is not fear, it is clarity. The most dangerous thing a citizen can do in this moment is look away from what is actually unfolding. The second most dangerous is to assume that the people in charge have a coherent plan for managing it. Watch the Strait of Hormuz, watch Taiwan, watch what happens when the grocery bill doubles and the retirement account contracts. Watch which leaders are willing to speak plainly about what they observe and which ones are not. Watch the dominoes, because the question of whether enough people are paying attention to the sequence while there is still time to influence it is not a rhetorical question. It is the only question that history will ultimately ask of this moment. And the answer history gives to that question is always the same. The moments when catastrophe was avoided were not the moments when governments suddenly became wiser or adversaries suddenly became more reasonable. They were the moments when enough people, citizens, analysts, journalists, ordinary individuals with no institutional power, were paying close enough attention to the actual sequence of events that the political cost of continuing down the escalatory path exceeded the political cost of finding an alternative. That is how the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, not because Kennedy and Khrushchev were uniquely rational men operating in a uniquely rational system, but because both leaders understood that the domestic and international political consequences of nuclear exchange were ones neither government could survive, and because back-channel communication, however degraded, remained functional enough to find the terms of a mutual stand-down. What I observe in the current environment that makes this historical parallel both instructive and imperfect is the communication piece. In 1962, the hotline between Washington and Moscow did not yet exist in its modern form, but the diplomatic channels through which Khrushchev and Kennedy found their off-ramp were open and being actively used by both sides. Today, as the Doomsday Clock panel documented in its 2026 assessment, the communication architecture between nuclear adversaries is at its lowest functional level since the early Cold War. The back channels are narrower. The personal relationships between decision makers at the highest levels are weaker or non-existent. The institutional knowledge of how to manage a crisis at the nuclear threshold, knowledge that was hard-won across decades of Cold War diplomacy and encoded in treaties, protocols, and relationships, has been allowed to atrophy at precisely the moment it is most needed. That atrophy is not irreversible. Institutions can be rebuilt. Communication channels can be reopened. Diplomatic relationships can be reconstructed even between adversaries with profound and genuine conflicts of interest, because the alternative to managing those conflicts through diplomacy is managing them through the machinery of escalation. And that machinery does not discriminate between the interests of the governments that set it in motion and the interests of the populations those governments are supposed to protect. The dominoes I have described in this analysis are not yet all in motion. Some are falling, some are tipping, some are still standing in positions from which they could be steadied if the decision to steady them is made before the next impact arrives. The window for those decisions is not infinite. It is measured in the same units as the doomsday clock, not in years or decades, but in the much shorter intervals that the current pace of escalation is consuming. 89 seconds is not a comfortable margin. It is a warning, and warnings only serve their purpose if the people who receive them treat them as the thing they are.